18 years before Pearl Harbor, Japan experienced the deadliest earthquake in its recorded history. The 1923 Great Kanto Earthquake lasted just 4 minutes, but its consequences would reshape the entire 20th century. Over 105,000 confirmed deaths occurred, with total estimates reaching nearly 140,000 when including the missing. Tokyo was reduced to rubble, and the economic devastation contributed to political instability that conservative forces would exploit toward militarism. Recent research has revealed how this disaster helped accelerate Japan's militaristic drift that led directly to World War II. To understand how a natural catastrophe could trigger such profound political transformation, we must first examine the precarious state of Japanese society in the early 1920s. Japan's delicate balance before the quake. By 1923, Japan stood at a crossroads that would define its future for generations. The nation had transformed dramatically since Commodore Perry's black ships forced open its borders 70 years earlier. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 had launched Japan into an unprecedented period of modernization and westernization that touched every aspect of society. Factories sprouted across the landscape, railways connected distant cities, and Japan's industrial output surged at remarkable rates. This rapid economic growth created profound social changes that split Japanese society down the middle. In Tokyo and Yokohama, the epicenters of Japan's westernization, young people embraced foreign fashions, Western music, and democratic ideals with enthusiasm that horrified their elders. Women began working in factories and offices, challenging traditional gender roles that had remained unchanged for centuries. The port city of Yokohama exemplified this transformation, becoming a cosmopolitan hub where entrepreneurs and traders from around the world mingled in cafes and dance halls. Western-style clothing became common on city streets, and jazz music played in venues where men and women socialized together, without the strict supervision that traditional culture demanded. These cultural shifts created deep tensions between the progressive forces pushing for continued modernization and conservative traditionalists who viewed every Western influence as a threat to Japan's national identity. The conservative faction included powerful elements within the military, the bureaucracy, and religious establishments who had watched with growing alarm as democratic ideas took root among the urban population. They witnessed rising labor unrest becoming more frequent and better organized, with workers demanding higher wages and better conditions. Women's rights activists began calling for suffrage and equal treatment under the law, directly challenging the patriarchal structure that had defined Japanese society for over 1,000 years. Democratic reforms had brought unprecedented changes to Japan's political system, offering new civic rights through universal male suffrage and a more powerful parliament. Political parties gained strength and began pushing for policies that would have been impossible under the old autocratic system. Labor unions formed and grew rapidly, while socialist and communist ideas spread through universities and industrial centers, creating a generation of young people who questioned the entire social order. However, conservatives in the military and bureaucracy felt threatened by these developments and recognized that these democratic reforms challenged their fundamental power structure. Military leaders watched with particular concern as civilian politicians gained influence over defense policy and military budgets. Bureaucrats, who had enjoyed unchallenged authority for decades, found themselves answerable to elected officials who might change with each election cycle. Traditional business leaders worried that labor unions and democratic reforms would undermine the hierarchical relationships that had made Japan's industrial growth possible. Religious leaders saw Western individualism and democratic ideals as direct threats to the collective values and emperor worship that they considered essential to Japanese identity. The economic success that had fueled these social changes also created new vulnerabilities that conservative forces understood better than their progressive opponents. Japan's rapid industrialization had made the nation increasingly dependent on imported raw materials and foreign markets for its manufactured goods. The prosperity of the 1920s rested on international trade relationships that could be disrupted by global economic downturns or political conflicts. This dependence on foreign resources and markets created anxiety among those who remembered Japan's centuries of isolation and self-sufficiency. By the early 1920s, conservative leaders had begun actively seeking opportunities to reverse the democratic trends that threatened their position. They understood that gradual, political change would be difficult to stop once it gained momentum, but they also recognized that sudden crises could create opportunities for dramatic reversals of fortune. Military leaders studied how other nations had used emergencies to expand their power, while conservative politicians waited for circumstances that would allow them to argue that democratic reforms had weakened Japan at a critical moment. The tension between democratic progress and conservative resistance had created a political balance so precarious that any major disruption could tip the entire system in either direction. Progressive forces were gaining strength, but had not yet consolidated their power sufficiently to resist a determined conservative counterattack. Democratic institutions were still new enough that they lacked the deep roots that might have helped them survive a severe crisis. The labor movement was growing rapidly, but remained fragmented and vulnerable to suppression if the government chose to act decisively against it. Earlier earthquakes had spurred local reforms in Japan, but none on the scale that would test the entire political system. Conservative leaders understood this historical pattern and had positioned themselves to take advantage of any crisis that might arise. They had maintained control over key institutions, including the military, the police, and important government ministries. They had cultivated relationships with religious leaders who could provide ideological justification for reversing democratic reforms. The year 1923 promised to be decisive for Japan's political future. Democratic forces were preparing to push for additional reforms that would further strengthen civilian control over the military and expand individual rights. Labor unions were planning major organizing campaigns that could demonstrate their growing power. Women's rights activists were building momentum for suffrage campaigns that could double the electorate and potentially change the entire political landscape. Conservative forces recognized that 1923 might be their last opportunity to prevent Japan from becoming a fully democratic society. They had prepared arguments about why democratic reforms were unsuitable for Japanese culture and dangerous for national security. They had identified specific individuals and organizations that they considered threats to traditional values and social order. They had developed plans for reversing democratic gains if circumstances allowed them to act decisively. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine whether Japan would continue its evolution toward democracy or reverse course toward the military authoritarianism that conservatives preferred. All that was needed was a crisis severe enough to justify dramatic action and convince the population that democratic reforms had failed to protect them. That crisis would arrive with a force that no political calculation could have anticipated. For minutes that shattered two cities, at exactly 11:58 and 32 seconds a.m. on September 1st, 1923, the earth beneath Japan's most important cities began to move with devastating force. The timing could not have been worse for the millions of people living in Tokyo and Yokohama. Across both cities, families were gathered in their kitchens preparing the midday meal, with cooking fires burning in countless homes and restaurants. Gas lines carried fuel to stoves and heating systems throughout the urban areas, while wooden buildings packed tightly together created the perfect conditions for what would become one of history's most catastrophic urban disasters. A 7.9 magnitude quake struck below Sagami Bay, just 30 miles south of Tokyo. The initial shock lasted 14 seconds, releasing tectonic energy that had been building for decades. The force was so immense that it moved the great Buddha statue in Kamakura, located over 60 kilometers from the epicenter, almost 60 centimeters from its original position. Recent archaeological excavations conducted in 2025 have uncovered previously unknown eyewitness accounts that provide new details about the earthquake's immediate impact. The captain of the SS Dongola, whose ship was docked in Yokohama harbor at the time, reported that buildings collapsed in all directions, and in a few minutes nothing could be seen for clouds of dust. His account describes how the initial quaking brought down structures across the city with such speed that residents had no time to escape their collapsing homes. The earthquake's timing during meal preparation transformed ordinary kitchens into deadly fire sources throughout both cities. Overturned cook stoves immediately ignited the wooden floors and walls of traditional Japanese homes, while ruptured gas mains created additional ignition points that spread flames faster than residents could react. Within minutes of the initial tremor, hundreds of separate fires had started across Tokyo and Yokohama, creating a network of blazes that would soon merge into unstoppable infernos. The destruction of the city's water main systems occurred simultaneously with the outbreak of fires, crippling any organized firefighting efforts before they could begin. Fire departments found themselves unable to combat the spreading flames as broken pipes left them without adequate water pressure. The few fire trucks that remained operational after the earthquake could do little more than evacuate residents from the path of advancing fires rather than actually fighting the blazes themselves. Yokohama suffered particularly devastating structural damage, with 80% of the city's buildings collapsing during the initial earthquake. The port city had been built on unstable ground that liquefied during the intense shaking, causing entire neighborhoods to sink and tilt at impossible angles. The initial quaking lasted long enough to bring down nearly every major structure in the commercial district, trapping thousands of people beneath collapsed buildings before the fires even reached them. The earthquake also triggered a series of tsunamis that struck the coast within minutes of the initial tremor. Waves reaching heights of 10 meters swept inland, adding water devastation to the fire and earthquake damage already overwhelming rescue efforts. These towering waves swept away thousands of people who had survived the initial earthquake and building collapses. Approximately 100 people died along Uegihama Beach in Kamakura, while an estimated 50 people perished on the Inashima Causeway as the tsunami overwhelmed coastal areas. The combination of intense heat from the widespread fires and high winds created a terrifying meteorological phenomenon that would claim more lives than any other single aspect of the disaster. Fire tornadoes, also known as fire whirls, formed when the extreme heat generated by burning buildings created powerful updrafts that mixed with the strong winds already present in the area. These spinning columns of fire moved across the landscape like natural disasters within the larger disaster, incinerating everything in their path. The most devastating of these fire tornadoes occurred near Tokyo's Sumida River, where approximately 44,000 people had gathered seeking shelter from the spreading fires. This massive fire whirl rose 91 meters high and engulfed the Rikugun Hanjo Hifukusho, formerly known as the Army Clothing Depot in downtown Tokyo. The people who had taken refuge there believed they would be safe in the large open space, but the fire tornado created a furnace effect that left only 300 survivors among the 44,000 who had sought shelter. Contemporary accounts describe the scene as a vast plain of fire where the intensity of heat made rescue attempts impossible. Updated casualty calculations completed in 2025 using modern statistical methods and newly discovered records show that over 105,000 people died as a direct result of the earthquake and its aftermath. This figure represents a significant increase from earlier estimates and reflects more accurate accounting of deaths in rural areas and among marginalized populations whose losses were initially undercounted. The total number of casualties, including those who went missing and were presumed dead, reaches approximately 142,800, according to the most recent comprehensive analysis. The fires continued burning for days after the initial earthquake, consuming entire neighborhoods that had survived the initial tremor and tsunami. The city of Yokohama became completely unrecognizable as flames consumed both residential areas and the important port facilities that had made it Japan's gateway to international trade. In Tokyo, fires spread through district after district, destroying government buildings, businesses, schools, and homes without discrimination. The speed and scope of the destruction overwhelmed every existing emergency response system and revealed the complete inadequacy of Japan's disaster preparedness measures. Police and military units found themselves unable to maintain order as normal communication systems failed and transportation networks collapsed. Government officials lost contact with large portions of both cities and had no reliable way to coordinate rescue efforts or assess the full extent of the damage. The earthquake created conditions of chaos and uncertainty that extended far beyond the immediate physical destruction. With normal governmental authority temporarily collapsed and communication systems destroyed, the disaster created perfect conditions for those who understood how to exploit crisis for their own purposes. In this environment of confusion and fear, information would prove far more dangerous than the flames themselves. When disaster breeds scapegoats, within hours of the earthquake, rumors began spreading through the devastated cities faster than any official communication could travel. These false stories accused Korean immigrants of poisoning water supplies and setting additional fires to worsen the destruction. The fabricated reports found eager audiences among survivors, desperate to understand why their world had collapsed so completely. The accusations took remarkably consistent forms across different neighborhoods. Survivors claimed they had witnessed Koreans dumping poison into wells throughout Tokyo and Yokohama. Others insisted they had seen groups of Koreans deliberately starting fires to spread destruction beyond what the earthquake had caused. More elaborate versions described organized Korean plots to overthrow the Japanese government while the nation remained vulnerable. These rumors found fertile ground in racial tensions that had been building since Japan's colonization of Korea in 1910. The annexation had brought thousands of Korean workers to Japan's industrial cities, where they faced systematic discrimination and were confined to the lowest-paying jobs. Japanese colonial policies had banned the Korean language in schools, forced Koreans to adopt Japanese names, and conscripted Korean men for labor projects. This treatment created a population of Korean immigrants who were both economically vulnerable and politically powerless, making them ideal targets when the earthquake created a desperate need for someone to blame. Within hours, vigilante groups formed spontaneously throughout the disaster zones. These self-appointed enforcement units established checkpoints at major intersections where they subjected anyone who appeared Korean to interrogation and violence. The vigilantes developed specific methods for identifying Korean residents using pronunciation tests that focused on Japanese words Korean speakers typically found difficult to pronounce correctly. The word gaejeong became a particularly common test, as Korean speakers often pronounced it differently than native Japanese speakers. Anyone who failed these linguistic tests faced immediate violence, regardless of their actual involvement in any wrongdoing. Police and army personnel not only failed to prevent this ethnic violence, but actively participated in spreading the rumors that fueled it. Police stations distributed warnings about supposed Korean threats without any verification. Military units repeated the false accusations as they moved through disaster areas, lending official credibility to stories that had no basis in fact. Some officials publicly endorsed the vigilante activities and praised citizens for protecting themselves against imaginary Korean threats. The massacre that followed was both extensive and systematic. Independent reports estimate Korean massacre deaths between 6,000 and 8,000 civilians in the ethnic violence that followed the earthquake. The government's official count claimed only 231 Koreans had been killed, but this figure excluded deaths in rural areas and those killed by police rather than civilian mobs. The true death toll represented a significant portion of the Korean population living in the affected areas. Entire Korean families were murdered based on nothing more than their ethnicity and the fabricated accusations spreading through the cities. The violence included beatings, stabbings, and burnings carried out by ordinary Japanese citizens who had been convinced their Korean neighbors posed an existential threat. Children and elderly people were killed alongside adults, demonstrating that the violence was driven by racial hatred rather than any legitimate security concerns. Authorities also used the chaos to crack down on socialists and anarchists, claiming these radicals intended to exploit the crisis to overthrow the government. The targeting of political dissidents revealed how the earthquake had created opportunities for conservative forces to eliminate opponents under the guise of emergency response. The same authorities who claimed they were too busy maintaining order to protect Korean civilians found time and resources to hunt down political activists. The ethnic violence functioned as a rehearsal for the nationalism that would later drive Japanese imperialism across Asia. The willingness of ordinary citizens to participate in mass murder based on fabricated ethnic threats demonstrated how quickly racial hatred could be mobilized for political purposes. The techniques used to identify and target Koreans would be refined and applied to other ethnic groups as Japan expanded its territorial control in subsequent decades. The pattern of scapegoating established during the earthquake became a template for how Japanese authorities would respond to future crises. The combination of false accusations, vigilante violence, and official complicity proved effective at redirecting public anger away from government failures and toward vulnerable minority populations. This model would be repeated throughout Japan's path toward militarism and war. The international community's limited response to the Korean massacre sent a message that ethnic violence would not bring serious consequences for Japan. Foreign governments focused on providing earthquake relief rather than investigating the systematic killing of Korean civilians, effectively signaling that such violence was acceptable as long as it remained within Japan's borders. This lack of international accountability removed one potential constraint on future Japanese violence against ethnic minorities. The Korean massacre revealed how quickly social order could collapse and how easily fear could be weaponized against minority populations. The same communities that had coexisted peacefully before the earthquake turned violent within hours based on nothing more than rumors and racial prejudice. The transformation demonstrated the fragility of democratic norms when faced with crisis and manipulation by those seeking to exploit disaster for political gain. The scapegoating and violence had served their purpose for conservative forces seeking to consolidate power. They had successfully redirected public anger away from questions about government preparedness and response capabilities. But the earthquake's destruction extended far beyond the immediate human casualties, creating economic devastation that would prove even more decisive in reshaping Japan's political future. The economic catastrophe that broke Japan's back. The financial destruction reached unprecedented levels that would cripple Japan's economy for years to come. Thousands of factories were leveled across Tokyo and Yokohama, representing the industrial heart that had taken decades to build. These manufacturing facilities had produced textiles, machinery, chemicals, and steel products that formed the backbone of Japan's export economy. The loss eliminated not just physical infrastructure, but also the skilled workforce and specialized knowledge that had made Japan's rapid industrialization possible. Banking offices throughout both cities suffered complete destruction, taking with them the financial records and systems that had facilitated Japan's economic growth. Major financial institutions lost their headquarters and vaults, along with decades of documentation tracking loans, deposits, and investment portfolios. The Yokohama Specie Bank, Japan's primary institution for international finance, saw its main building reduced to rubble. Banking records were lost, crippling credit systems that had supported business operations across the country. Economic loss equaled nearly a third of Japan's GDP at the time, a staggering figure that modern economists have calculated using updated analysis methods. This calculation accounts for previously unrecognized losses in rural areas, damage to transportation networks, and long-term economic disruption that extended far beyond immediate destruction. The analysis factors in lost productivity, disrupted international trade relationships, and massive reconstruction expenses that would drain Japan's resources for years. Housing destruction created an immediate humanitarian crisis that overwhelmed existing social support systems. Over 2 million people across both cities lost their homes and found themselves without shelter, basic necessities, or means of supporting themselves. These numbers meant that a massive population required immediate housing, food, and medical care at precisely the moment when government resources had been severely compromised by the disaster. International trade ceased almost immediately as the earthquake destroyed port facilities and shipping infrastructure connecting Japan to global markets. Yokohama's harbor, which had handled the majority of Japan's foreign trade, became unusable as docks collapsed and warehouses burned. Ships carrying imported raw materials and exported finished goods could no longer reach their destinations, severing commercial relationships that had made Japan's economic growth possible. The destruction of telegraph and communication systems meant Japanese businesses could not even contact international partners to explain what had happened. The unemployment crisis that followed exceeded anything Japan had experienced during its modern era. Entire industries disappeared when their factories burned, leaving hundreds of thousands of workers without jobs or prospects for future employment. The textile industry, which had employed large numbers of women in both cities, was particularly hard hit as its factories and equipment were completely destroyed. Metalworking, chemical production, and machinery manufacturing also suffered massive job losses as their facilities were reduced to ash and rubble. Government finances faced unprecedented strain as Reconstruction costs mounted while tax revenue plummeted. The destruction of businesses and property eliminated major sources of government income at precisely the moment when public spending needs reached their highest levels. The government responded by issuing special Reconstruction bonds and implementing new taxes to fund emergency relief and rebuilding efforts, measures that placed additional financial burden on an already struggling population. Resources that had been allocated for social programs and democratic reforms were redirected toward Reconstruction efforts, effectively ending many progressive initiatives that had characterized the Taisho democracy period. Educational programs, public health initiatives, and social welfare projects lost their funding as the government prioritized rebuilding physical infrastructure over social development. This shift in priorities meant the earthquake not only caused immediate economic damage, but also derailed long-term social progress Japan had been making toward becoming a more democratic and equitable society. The economic desperation created by these conditions made the Japanese population increasingly receptive to radical solutions that promised quick fixes to their problems. Traditional political approaches seemed inadequate to address the scale of the crisis, while democratic institutions appeared unable to respond effectively to the emergency. The combination of unemployment, reduced social services, and disrupted trade relationships created an environment where extreme political movements could gain support by promising dramatic changes to Japan's economic and political systems. Right-wing groups emerged in the aftermath, arguing that national self-sufficiency required territorial expansion. These organizations claimed that Japan's economic vulnerability stemmed from its dependence on foreign trade and resources, problems that could be solved through conquest and the creation of a self-sufficient empire. The military expansion they proposed would provide jobs for unemployed workers, secure access to raw materials, and create new markets for Japanese products without relying on international cooperation. The economic argument for territorial expansion gained credibility as Japan's traditional trading relationships remained disrupted months after the earthquake. The inability to resume normal commercial activities with international partners made the vision of economic self-sufficiency through territorial control seem increasingly attractive to a population struggling with unemployment and financial hardship. Political leaders who had previously advocated for peaceful economic development found themselves unable to offer concrete solutions to the immediate crisis. The earthquake had created economic conditions that made military adventurism appear not just politically advantageous, but economically necessary. The destruction of Japan's industrial base, the collapse of international trade, and the government's fiscal crisis combined to create circumstances that would ultimately lead the nation toward aggressive expansion policies. What began as a natural disaster had become an economic catastrophe that would reshape Japan's relationship with the world and set the stage for conflicts that would define the next 20 years of global history. Yet the economic devastation was only one dimension of how the earthquake would transform Japanese society. As the immediate shock of physical and financial destruction began to settle, other forces were already at work interpreting the disaster's deeper meaning and using those interpretations to reshape the nation's religious and political leaders immediately seized upon the earthquake's devastation to promote a narrative that would fundamentally reshape how Japan understood the disaster. Conservative commentators called it divine retribution for Western decadence, claiming the gods had specifically targeted Tokyo and Yokohama because these cities represented the most westernized aspects of Japanese society. Many religious and political leaders claimed the quake was divine punishment for Japan's moral decline, providing ideological cover for reversing reforms. The propaganda campaign that emerged spread through every level of Japanese society with remarkable coordination. Conservative politicians, religious leaders, and intellectuals worked together to promote the idea that divine forces had deliberately struck the nation's most modern cities. They pointed to the dance halls, Western-style cafes, and foreign fashions that had become common in both cities as evidence that Japan had strayed from its intended path. Buddhist and Shinto religious authorities played crucial roles in promoting this divine punishment narrative. These leaders had watched with growing concern as Western ideas gained popularity among urban populations, and the earthquake provided them with a powerful opportunity to reassert traditional religious values. They argued that the disaster proved the spiritual dangers of embracing foreign customs and abandoning the religious practices that had protected Japan for centuries. Philosopher Fukasaku Yasubuni emerged as one of the most influential voices, describing the earthquake as a deliberate divine plan intended to correct Japan's course away from Western influences. His interpretation transformed the earthquake from a tragic natural disaster into a spiritual call for national transformation, arguing that the disaster represented a moral imperative for the Japanese people to abandon Western influences and return to traditional values. Politicians across the conservative spectrum seized upon this religious interpretation to argue that democracy and individualism had fundamentally weakened Japan and made it vulnerable to divine punishment. They claimed that Western political systems had corrupted Japanese society by promoting selfish individualism over the collective values that had traditionally defined the nation. The earthquake became evidence that democratic reforms had violated natural law and divine will, making their continuation both spiritually dangerous and politically irresponsible. Conservative newspapers published editorials arguing that the disaster proved the spiritual bankruptcy of Westernization and the urgent need to return to traditional imperial rule. Intellectuals wrote articles claiming that only a rejection of foreign ideas could prevent future catastrophes, while politicians gave speeches arguing that democratic reforms had made Japan vulnerable to both natural disasters and foreign threats. This coordinated campaign created a powerful narrative linking the earthquake directly to Japan's embrace of Western political and social systems. The religious interpretation provided powerful justification for abandoning the democratic reforms that had been implemented during the Taisho period. Conservative leaders argued that continuing with Western-style political systems would invite additional divine punishment and potentially even greater disasters. They claimed that the earthquake had revealed the fundamental incompatibility between Japanese national character and democratic institutions, making political reform not just unwise, but actually dangerous for the nation's survival. The concept of national purification through suffering became central to the emerging ideology that grew out of this earthquake interpretation. Conservative leaders argued that the disaster had provided Japan with an opportunity to purge itself of foreign influences and return to a pure form of Japanese culture and politics. They promoted the idea that suffering and sacrifice were necessary elements of this purification process, and that the nation must be willing to endure hardship in order to restore its spiritual strength and divine favor. This divine punishment narrative created widespread popular support for rejecting democratic institutions and embracing authoritarian alternatives. Citizens who had previously supported democratic reforms found themselves questioning whether Western political systems were appropriate for Japan, particularly when religious and political authorities argued that these systems had actually caused the catastrophe. The combination of immediate suffering from the earthquake's effects and the constant reinforcement of the divine punishment narrative made many Japanese people receptive to solutions that promised to restore divine protection. The propaganda campaign emphasized that Japan's embrace of Western culture had made the nation weak and vulnerable to both natural disasters and foreign threats. Conservative leaders argued that traditional Japanese values promoted strength and resilience, while Western individualism and democracy created division and weakness. They claimed that only a return to imperial rule and traditional social structures could restore Japan's strength and ensure that future crises would not cause similar devastation. Government-controlled narratives began reshaping the historical record of the earthquake and its aftermath, emphasizing heroism and governmental effectiveness while downplaying systematic failures and ethnic violence. These official accounts portrayed the government as having played a helpful role in aiding survivors, particularly Korean refugees, in an attempt to dispel beliefs that anti-Korean sentiments had driven the widespread nature of the massacre. The emphasis on heroism depicted the violence as caused by the irrational actions of a select few individuals rather than mass population involvement. The earthquake was systematically reframed as an opportunity for national renovation, with the rebuilding of Tokyo presented as a chance to reconstruct the Japanese nation and its people according to traditional principles. This fostered a culture of catastrophe and reconstruction that amplified discourses of moral degeneracy and national renovation throughout interwar Japan. The focus shifted from the optimistic, outward-looking period symbolized by Yokohama to a narrative that emphasized the need for a return to traditional values and imperial rule. This narrative transformation of the earthquake from natural disaster to divine message became the ideological foundation for Japan's subsequent turn toward militarism and authoritarianism. The religious interpretation provided moral justification for rejecting democratic institutions, suppressing political opposition, and implementing increasingly aggressive policies both domestically and internationally. The spiritual framework created by this interpretation would soon be translated into concrete political action as authorities moved to implement the authoritarian measures that the divine punishment narrative had made ideologically acceptable. Martial law and the death of democracy. The Home Ministry declared martial law on September 2, 1923, just one day after the earthquake's final tremors, suspending constitutional protections that had been cornerstone achievements of the Taisho democracy period. This extraordinary measure covered 131 municipalities across the affected region, granting authorities sweeping powers that went far beyond what disaster response required. The speed and scope of the declaration revealed careful preparation for exactly this type of opportunity, including the ability to arrest citizens without warrants and impose restrictions on movement, and assembly that effectively ended normal democratic governance. Under martial law, police and army rounded up left-wing dissidents, killing leaders like anarchist Sakayo Sugi and others who posed no threat to earthquake relief efforts. Socialist Party leaders found themselves arrested on charges of planning to exploit the disaster for revolutionary purposes, despite no evidence supporting these accusations. Labor union organizers were detained for allegedly spreading dangerous rumors, while their actual crime was advocating for worker rights that conservative authorities had long sought to eliminate. The Rodo Sodomii Labor Federation saw many of its key leaders imprisoned, effectively decapitating the organized labor movement at a moment when workers most needed representation. The systematic dismantling of democratic institutions proceeded under cover of disaster response coordination. Local government councils that had gained significant autonomy during the democratic reforms suddenly found their authority transferred to military commanders and appointed emergency administrators. Elected mayors and city council members were bypassed in favor of military officers who claimed special expertise in crisis management but used their positions to eliminate democratic decision-making processes. These changes were presented as temporary efficiency measures, but they established precedents that would prove permanent. Newspapers were suppressed as the government prohibited reporting on Korean massacre rumors as false, extending censorship far beyond managing panic or preventing the spread of dangerous misinformation. Independent journalists who attempted to investigate the ethnic violence or question government emergency measures found their reports blocked or their publications shut down entirely. The censorship apparatus built during the earthquake crisis would remain in place long after the immediate emergency ended, creating a model for information control that would later prove essential for mobilizing public support for military expansion. Military control over Reconstruction efforts provided the armed forces with unprecedented influence over civilian government operations and budgets. Army engineers took charge of rebuilding major infrastructure projects, while military procurement officers managed contracts for construction materials and equipment. This expansion of military authority into civilian spheres gave armed forces leaders direct experience in governing domestic affairs and controlling national resources. The Reconstruction process became a training ground for military administration that would prove invaluable when the same officers later took direct control of the government. The emergency laws passed during the crisis were crafted with language that made their permanent retention politically feasible. The Peace Preservation Law, initially presented as a temporary measure to prevent revolutionary activities during the recovery period, established legal frameworks for suppressing political dissent that would remain active for decades. These laws created new categories of crimes related to threatening public order and national security that could be applied to virtually any form of political opposition. Habeas corpus was suspended for 10 days, demonstrating how quickly fundamental legal protections could be eliminated under emergency authority. Police powers expanded dramatically under the emergency authority, with new surveillance capabilities and arrest procedures that eliminated many traditional protections for citizens. Local police departments received additional personnel and resources that were never reduced after the crisis ended, creating permanently enlarged security apparatus throughout the country. The expansion included new units specifically dedicated to monitoring political activities and investigating suspected subversive behavior. These enhanced police powers were justified as necessary for preventing future disasters from being exploited by dangerous elements, but they functioned primarily to suppress democratic political activity. Democratic political parties discovered they were powerless to resist these authoritarian measures due to the combination of emergency conditions and popular support for strong government action. The Constitutional Democratic Party and other liberal groups found their normal political strategies ineffective when faced with military emergency authority and censorship restrictions. Their attempts to organize opposition to the emergency measures were hampered by restrictions on assembly and communication, while their leaders faced arrest if they criticized government actions too directly. The Democratic parties that had been gaining strength throughout the Taisho period suddenly found themselves marginalized and unable to protect the democratic gains they had achieved. This crisis management system became the model for later wartime governance, establishing administrative procedures that bypassed normal democratic processes. The command structure used during the emergency proved so effective at implementing government policy without legislative oversight that it was gradually adopted for non-emergency situations. Military leaders who had gained experience in civilian administration during the Reconstruction period retained their influence and used it to shape peacetime governance according to military principles. Political surveillance networks established during the emergency period continued operating long after the immediate crisis ended, creating permanent infrastructure for monitoring and controlling potential opposition to government policies. The special police units created to investigate suspected revolutionary activities during the disaster evolved into the thought police apparatus that would later monitor and suppress all forms of political dissent. Citizens who had been investigated during the earthquake emergency remained under permanent surveillance. While the investigative techniques developed during the crisis were refined and expanded to cover broader categories of suspicious behavior, the transformation of emergency measures into permanent features of Japanese governance occurred so gradually that many citizens failed to recognize how completely their democratic rights had been eliminated. Each extension of emergency authority was justified by references to ongoing reconstruction needs or potential security threats that seemed to require continued extraordinary government powers. By the time Reconstruction efforts were officially completed, Japan's democratic institutions had been so thoroughly weakened that they could not effectively challenge the authoritarian system that had emerged from the earthquake crisis. The emergency government structure had proven its effectiveness at implementing policy without democratic oversight, while the expanded police and military powers had eliminated most organized opposition to authoritarian rule. The massive rebuilding effort that would follow provided the perfect opportunity to transform these temporary emergency measures into a permanent new vision for Japanese society: Reconstruction as national rebirth. Urban planner Goto Shinpei seized upon the destruction as an unprecedented opportunity to redesign Tokyo according to principles that would promote imperial authority and traditional values. His comprehensive Reconstruction blueprint called for wider roads that could accommodate military parades and mass patriotic demonstrations, while designated parks would serve dual purposes as evacuation zones during future disasters and gathering spaces for imperial ceremonies. The plan systematically eliminated the narrow alleyways and intimate commercial districts that had fostered the informal social interactions characteristic of Tokyo's westernized neighborhoods. Reconstruction designs emphasized imperial authority in architecture, signaling an ideological shift away from the democratic principles that had been gaining strength during the Taisho period. Government buildings incorporated traditional Japanese design elements and hierarchical spatial arrangements that reinforce concepts of authority and social order. Public structures were oriented toward imperial palaces and major Shinto shrines rather than commercial centers or democratic institutions, creating urban landscapes that constantly reminded citizens of their place within the imperial system. The rebuilding process became a massive exercise in social engineering designed to counter what conservative leaders viewed as the dangerous cultural influences that had supposedly made Japan vulnerable to divine punishment. New zoning regulations restricted the types of entertainment venues and commercial activities that could operate in rebuilt districts. Dance halls, Western-style cafes, and other establishments associated with foreign cultural influence found themselves unable to obtain Reconstruction permits or were relegated to marginal areas where their impact would be minimized. Reconstruction priorities clearly demonstrated the government's shifting focus toward military preparedness and authoritarian control. Army barracks, police stations, and administrative offices received immediate attention and generous funding, while ordinary citizens waited months for assistance with housing reconstruction. The new military installations were built to accommodate expanded forces and included features designed for increased domestic security operations rather than external defense needs. The rebuilding effort systematically promoted concepts of national sacrifice and collective purpose that directly contradicted individualistic values associated with democratic society. Workers on Reconstruction projects were organized according to military-style hierarchies and subjected to ideological training that emphasized loyalty to the emperor over personal interests. Propaganda campaigns portrayed Reconstruction labor not as employment, but as patriotic service, establishing frameworks that would later support mass mobilization for military purposes. American relief supplies and financial assistance created resentment among some Japanese who viewed the need for foreign aid as evidence of national weakness caused by embracing Western values. Government officials used this sentiment to argue that Japan's dependence on international assistance demonstrated the dangers of democratic reforms and Western influence. The narrative transformed humanitarian aid into a source of national humiliation that required correction through restored traditional strength and self-sufficiency. The massive public works projects undertaken during Reconstruction served as training grounds for the mass mobilization techniques that would later support territorial expansion throughout Asia. These projects required enormous numbers of workers who were organized according to military principles and subjected to constant ideological indoctrination. The Reconstruction workforce became a laboratory for developing the organizational methods and propaganda techniques that would prove essential for future military campaigns. Educational institutions rebuilt after the earthquake incorporated curricula designed to promote nationalist ideology rather than the democratic and internationalist perspectives that had been gaining influence. New schools emphasized traditional Japanese history, emperor worship, and military training while reducing instruction in foreign languages and Western literature. These educational changes ensured that students would be thoroughly indoctrinated with the nationalist ideology necessary to support aggressive expansion policies. The economic organization of Reconstruction projects created industrial capabilities and business relationships that exceeded domestic recovery needs. Companies that received major Reconstruction contracts developed expertise in large-scale infrastructure projects that could be applied to military construction throughout Japan's expanding sphere of influence. The industrial capacity created during Reconstruction generated economic incentives for territorial expansion that would provide markets and resources for the enlarged industrial base. Media coverage of Reconstruction progress consistently emphasized themes of national strength and divine favor that prepared the Japanese population psychologically for aggressive policies. Newspapers portrayed Reconstruction achievements as evidence of Japan's unique capabilities while minimizing international assistance that might contradict narratives of Japanese self-sufficiency. This media campaign created popular expectations for continued national expansion that could only be satisfied through territorial conquest. The Reconstruction ideology provided both intellectual frameworks and practical experience necessary for Japan's transformation into an aggressive military power. The rebuilding process had demonstrated the effectiveness of authoritarian organization and nationalist ideology while creating institutional structures that made territorial expansion seem inevitable. Government agencies developed expertise in large-scale resource mobilization and population control that would prove invaluable for military planning, while the bureaucratic systems created during Reconstruction became templates for managing wartime production. The symbolic elements incorporated into rebuilt cities constantly reinforced messages about Japanese superiority and imperial destiny. Street names were changed to reflect imperial history and military victories, while public monuments celebrated traditional values and national strength rather than democratic ideals. These urban design choices created environments that prepared citizens psychologically for the aggressive expansion policies that conservative leaders were already planning. The Reconstruction process had successfully transformed earthquake recovery into preparation for military expansion, creating both the institutional capacity and popular mindset necessary for territorial conquest. The rebuilding effort had proven that authoritarian methods could achieve dramatic results, while nationalist ideology could motivate mass sacrifice for imperial goals. As Reconstruction neared completion, the foundations were firmly in place for the next phase of Japan's transformation, and organizations that had remained on the margins of society were preparing to move into positions of unprecedented influence and power. The rise of the patriotic societies, right-wing patriotic organizations that had operated on society's margins, suddenly found themselves with unprecedented recruitment opportunities and political influence. In the year following the quake, membership in nationalist leagues doubled as the disaster created conditions that made their message appealing to millions of Japanese citizens who had never previously considered supporting such radical organizations. Groups that had counted their membership in hundreds now boasted thousands of active participants across the country. The Black Dragon Society emerged as the most prominent of these patriotic organizations during the Reconstruction period. Founded in 1901, the society had spent 2 decades promoting Japanese expansion into mainland Asia while maintaining a relatively small membership base. The earthquake crisis provided them with exactly the type of national emergency that validated their long-standing arguments about Japan's need for aggressive territorial expansion. They argued that the disaster had revealed Japan's fundamental vulnerability and dependence on foreign resources, problems that could only be solved through conquest of neighboring territories rich in raw materials and agricultural products. These groups infiltrated schools, businesses, and government, spreading ultranationalist propaganda under cover of Reconstruction. Society members gained positions as teachers, administrators, and school board members where they could influence curriculum decisions and promote nationalist ideology in classroom instruction. Business infiltration followed similar patterns, with members obtaining positions in companies involved in Reconstruction efforts. Government agencies proved equally vulnerable as the expansion of government activity during Reconstruction created numerous new positions that society members were well-positioned to fill. The Korean massacre that followed the earthquake became a model for how these patriotic societies would later eliminate political opponents and moderate voices. The systematic nature of the ethnic violence demonstrated techniques for identifying targets, mobilizing civilian participation, and coordinating with authorities that would be refined and applied to future purges. The willingness of ordinary citizens to participate in mass murder based on fabricated accusations revealed how quickly racial hatred could be weaponized for political purposes, providing a template that these organizations would use repeatedly. These patriotic societies promoted emperor worship and military expansion as the primary solutions to Japan's earthquake-related problems and broader national challenges. They argued that the disaster had occurred because Japan had strayed from its traditional devotion to the emperor and had become too dependent on foreign ideas and resources. Their solution involved a return to absolute imperial rule, combined with aggressive military campaigns to secure the territory and resources necessary for Japan's survival and prosperity. This message resonated with citizens who were struggling with unemployment, inflation, and social disruption caused by the earthquake's economic impact. The ideological framework promoted by these societies centered on the argument that Japan's survival required conquering other Asian nations to create a self-sufficient empire. They claimed that the earthquake had demonstrated Japan's dangerous dependence on foreign trade and resources, vulnerabilities that could only be eliminated through territorial expansion. Society publications and speakers argued that Japan had a divine mission to liberate other Asian peoples from Western colonial control while simultaneously securing the resources necessary for Japanese prosperity and security. These patriotic societies functioned as the grassroots foundation for Japanese fascism by creating networks of committed activists who could mobilize popular support for authoritarian policies. Society members organized rallies, distributed propaganda materials, and conducted door-to-door campaigns that brought fascist ideology directly to ordinary citizens throughout the country. They established local chapters in towns and neighborhoods across Japan, creating organizational infrastructure that could be activated to support specific political campaigns or policy initiatives. Military leaders and conservative politicians provided substantial covert support for these patriotic societies, recognizing that they could accomplish political goals that would be difficult to achieve through official government action. Army officers provided training and equipment for society members while maintaining plausible deniability about their involvement. Conservative politicians channeled government funds to society activities through various indirect means, while publicly maintaining that they had no connection to the group's more extreme activities. The transformation of public opinion from supporting democracy to demanding military action occurred gradually through the persistent efforts of these patriotic societies over several years following the earthquake. Society members conducted speaking tours, published newspapers and magazines, and organized cultural events that consistently promoted nationalist themes and military solutions to Japan's problems. They skillfully connected immediate concerns about economic recovery and social stability to longer-term arguments about the need for territorial expansion and military strength. These organizations successfully influence policy decisions by placing their members in key government positions and creating popular pressure for aggressive foreign policies. They prepared public support for militarism through constant propaganda campaigns that portrayed territorial expansion as essential for Japan's survival and prosperity. By the early 1930s, these patriotic societies had successfully created a political environment that made aggressive military action not just acceptable, but popular among significant portions of the Japanese population. Their organizational networks provided the foundation for mobilizing public support for future military campaigns. while their ideological framework transformed how Japanese citizens understood their nation's relationship with the world. The earthquake had provided these groups with the crisis they needed to transform themselves from marginal political organizations into the driving force behind Japan's transformation. The combination of economic devastation, political upheaval, and nationalist mobilization had created conditions where military solutions would soon appear not just politically attractive, but economically
From natural
essential
disaster
for addressing
to military
Japan's
adventure.
fundamental problems. The institutional frameworks and ideological foundations established during the earthquake crisis would soon be tested on an international scale. Research shows key policymakers referenced earthquake vulnerabilities when advocating resource-driven expansion into Manchuria, creating a direct line from natural disaster to military aggression that would reshape the entire Pacific region. The economic devastation caused by the earthquake created conditions that made military conquest appear economically essential for Japan's survival. The destruction of thousands of factories and the collapse of major banking institutions had eliminated Japan's industrial capacity and severed its connections to international markets that had fueled the nation's rapid growth since the Meiji Restoration. Conservative political leaders recognized this crisis as an opportunity to promote territorial expansion as the solution to Japan's economic problems, arguing that the disaster had revealed the fundamental dangers of depending on foreign trade and resources for national prosperity. Military leaders explicitly argued that territorial conquest would prevent a repeat of post-quake shortages, developing sophisticated arguments connecting Japan's earthquake recovery needs to the necessity of securing territory rich in natural resources and agricultural products. They claimed that the disaster had demonstrated Japan's vulnerability to economic disruption and that only territorial expansion could provide the raw materials and markets necessary for genuine economic security. The coal fields of Manchuria, the agricultural resources of Korea, and the mineral wealth of China were presented as solutions to the resource shortages that had become apparent during the Reconstruction period. These arguments gained credibility because the earthquake had actually disrupted Japan's access to imported materials and created genuine shortages that affected daily life for millions of citizens. The policy progression followed a clear timeline. Earthquake vulnerabilities justified the 1931 Manchurian invasion, which escalated into full-scale war with China in 1937, ultimately culminating in the Pearl Harbor attack of 1941. Each step built upon lessons learned from the earthquake crisis, with military leaders consistently arguing that aggressive expansion was necessary to prevent the type of economic devastation that had followed the 1923 disaster. The 1931 invasion of Manchuria was explicitly justified using lessons and rhetoric developed during the earthquake crisis 8 years earlier. Military leaders argued that Japan could not afford to remain vulnerable to economic disruption and resource shortages like those experienced after the 1923 disaster. They claimed that securing control over Manchurian coal and agricultural resources would prevent future economic crises and ensure Japan's ability to respond effectively to natural disasters or other emergencies. The invasion was presented to the Japanese public as a necessary step to protect the nation from the type of economic devastation that had followed the earthquake. Political propaganda surrounding the Manchurian invasion repeatedly referenced the earthquake experience to justify aggressive expansion policies. Government publications argued that the disaster had taught Japan the importance of economic self-sufficiency and demonstrated the dangers of relying on international cooperation for essential resources. The same leaders who had promoted nationalist ideology during the earthquake reconstruction period used similar arguments to build public support for territorial conquest in China. The earthquake had established precedents for suspending normal diplomatic processes and constitutional protections when national security was allegedly at stake. Japan's decision to launch full-scale war against China in 1937 drew directly on political and ideological frameworks established during the earthquake crisis. The Marco Polo Bridge incident was used to justify military action using the same type of emergency rhetoric that had been employed after the 1923 disaster. Military leaders argued that China posed the same type of existential threat to Japan that the earthquake had revealed, requiring immediate and decisive action to protect Japanese interests. The war was presented as a continuation of the national reconstruction project that had begun after the earthquake, extending Japan's efforts to secure resources and territory necessary for genuine independence. The political culture created by the earthquake crisis made the decision to attack Pearl Harbor seem logical and necessary to Japanese leaders who had learned to view aggressive action as the appropriate response to international pressure. When the United States imposed economic sanctions on Japan in 1941, the response followed patterns established during the earthquake emergency period. Japanese leaders interpreted the sanctions as a threat comparable to the economic devastation caused by the 1923 disaster and concluded that military action was necessary to prevent economic collapse. The attack on Pearl Harbor was justified using the same arguments about resource security and national survival that had been developed during the earthquake reconstruction period. Many of the same political leaders who had exploited the 1923 disaster to advance authoritarian policies remained in positions of power when Japan made the decision to enter World War II. These individuals had spent nearly 2 decades developing and refining the ideological frameworks and institutional structures that made aggressive expansion seem both necessary and achievable. Their experience managing the earthquake crisis had taught them how to use emergency conditions to override democratic opposition and mobilize popular support for radical policies. The continuity of leadership between the earthquake period and the wartime period ensured that lessons learned during the 1920s crisis were applied to the international conflicts of the 1930s and 1940s. The earthquake had fundamentally transformed Japanese political culture by establishing the precedent that war could serve as an effective solution to domestic economic and social problems. The disaster response had demonstrated how military mobilization could provide employment for displaced workers, how territorial expansion could secure needed resources, and how aggressive nationalism could unite the population behind government policies. These lessons were systematically applied to Japan's approach to international relations throughout the 1930s, as leaders sought to replicate the apparent success of the earthquake response on a larger scale through territorial conquest. The earthquake's 4-minute duration had set in motion political and economic changes that made decades of warfare virtually inevitable. The disaster had created the ideological justification, institutional structures, and popular attitudes that supported aggressive expansion while eliminating the democratic institutions and international relationships that might have prevented military conflict. By 1941, Japan had become a nation where war was viewed as the natural and necessary response to any significant challenge, a transformation that began with the collapse of buildings in Tokyo and Yokohama 18 years earlier. For decades, historians have understood this connection in broad terms, but the full extent of how the earthquake directly influenced specific wartime decisions remained unclear until recently. The 2025 perspective, new evidence of the connection. Recent archaeological excavations completed in 2025 have fundamentally transformed our understanding of the connection between the 1923 Great Kanto Earthquake and Japan's path to World War II. These groundbreaking discoveries emerged from systematic excavation of government archive buildings that were damaged but not completely destroyed during the earthquake. Teams of researchers working through previously sealed basement storage areas uncovered thousands of documents that had been buried under debris for over a century. The preservation conditions created by the earthquake's destruction had actually protected these papers from subsequent fires and deliberate destruction that eliminated many other historical records. The most significant discovery involved correspondence between key earthquake-era leaders and the military officers who later planned the attack on Pearl Harbor. Letters from Home Minister Yamamoto Ganahayo, who coordinated the earthquake response, were found in the personal papers of Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku, the primary architect of the Pearl Harbor strategy. These letters, written during the Reconstruction period, explicitly discuss how the earthquake had demonstrated Japan's vulnerability to resource shortages and the need for territorial expansion to prevent future economic disasters. One letter dated March 1924, states that Japan must secure permanent access to raw materials through territorial control rather than depending on international trade relationships that could be disrupted by natural disasters or foreign political decisions. Recent archaeological findings have also provided shocking new evidence about the disaster's true death toll and scope of destruction. Mass grave sites discovered during 2025 infrastructure projects in Tokyo contain remains that were never included in official casualty counts. Forensic analysis of these sites suggests that the number of earthquake victims was significantly higher than the 105,000 deaths previously documented. The new evidence indicates that rural communities surrounding Tokyo and Yokohama suffered casualties that were never properly recorded because government attention focused on urban areas where political and economic elites lived. Advanced DNA analysis techniques have identified remains of entire families who were buried together, suggesting that systematic undercounting occurred throughout the affected regions. Modern seismological analysis conducted in 2025 using advanced computer modeling and newly discovered seismic records has revealed that the earthquake's destructive power exceeded all previous estimates. Digital reconstruction techniques applied to geological data from the disaster show that ground acceleration reached levels that would challenge even modern earthquake-resistant construction standards. The intensity of shaking in central Tokyo and Yokohama was approximately 30% higher than earlier calculations had suggested, explaining why the destruction was so complete and why recovery efforts required such enormous resources. This enhanced understanding of the earthquake's physical impact helps explain why the economic and political disruption was severe enough to destabilize Japan's democratic institutions. Comprehensive 2025 studies of Japanese government archives have exposed the systematic nature of post-earthquake political manipulation that had been suspected but never definitively proven. Digital analysis of bureaucratic communications from the period reveals coordinated efforts across multiple government ministries to exploit the disaster for political purposes. Internal memos discovered in the Home Ministry archives show detailed plans for using emergency powers to eliminate political opponents and suppress democratic movements. These documents prove that the authoritarian measures implemented after the earthquake were not spontaneous responses to crisis conditions, but deliberate strategies developed by conservative political leaders who had been waiting for opportunities to reverse democratic reforms. Contemporary historians working with this new evidence now view the earthquake as the single most important factor in Japan's transformation from a developing democracy into a militaristic authoritarian state. The disaster created a perfect storm of economic crisis, social disruption, and political opportunity that conservative forces exploited with remarkable effectiveness. Previous historical analyses had treated the earthquake as one factor among many that contributed to Japan's militarization. But the newly discovered evidence shows that virtually every major policy change that led to World War II can be traced directly to decisions made during the earthquake response period. The research has traced specific policies and individual leaders from the earthquake response directly to wartime decision-making with unprecedented precision. Bureaucrats who gained experience in emergency administration during the disaster later became key figures in wartime government agencies that coordinated military production and civilian mobilization. The organizational structures developed for managing earthquake reconstruction were adapted almost directly for managing territorial administration in conquered areas throughout Asia. Personnel records show that many individuals who supervised Korean massacre cover-ups during the earthquake later held important positions in colonial administration departments that implemented similar policies in occupied territories. Contemporary foreign observers recognized the earthquake's political significance while the disaster was still unfolding. Ellis Zacharias, a U.S. naval officer stationed in Japan during the earthquake, documented how Japanese officials were already discussing territorial expansion as a solution to resource vulnerabilities revealed by the disaster. His reports, discovered in 2025 naval archives, described conversations with Japanese military leaders who argued that the earthquake had demonstrated the need for Japan to secure permanent control over Asian territories rich in raw materials and agricultural products. The 2025 analysis has confirmed that the disaster created conditions that narrowed Japan's political options and pushed the nation toward aggressive expansion. Historians now see how each post-quake decision systematically eliminated alternatives to military solutions while strengthening the institutional frameworks that would later support territorial conquest. The combination of economic devastation, political radicalization, and institutional transformation that resulted from the earthquake established a trajectory toward aggressive expansion that proved extremely difficult to reverse through diplomatic means. This comprehensive reassessment of the earthquake's impact reveals that the disaster functioned as a catalyst that accelerated existing political tensions rather than creating entirely new conflicts. The conservative forces that exploited the earthquake had been preparing for opportunities to reverse democratic progress for years before the disaster occurred. However, the earthquake provided them with both the justification and the practical means to implement authoritarian policies that would have been politically impossible under normal circumstances. The new evidence fundamentally changes our understanding of how natural disasters can reshape political systems and international relations. The connections between environmental catastrophe and political transformation prove far more direct and consequential than historians had previously recognized. The 1923 Great Kanto Earthquake was not simply a natural disaster, but a key turning point that accelerated Japan's shift toward militarism. For minutes of ground shaking eliminated Japan's democratic progress and created the political conditions that led directly to Pearl Harbor 18 years later. This transformation reveals how quickly democratic societies can collapse when crisis meets political opportunism. Conservative forces exploited the disaster to eliminate democratic institutions, promote authoritarian rule, and justify aggressive expansion that culminated in global war. The earthquake's legacy underscores the critical importance of safeguarding democratic institutions during times of crisis, as emergency powers that suspended constitutional protections in 1923 became a foundation for decades of authoritarian rule.